Good evening, everyone. We welcome you all, and we are delighted to have you here for this interesting talk this evening. We're sorry we're starting a little late from the scheduled time, but hope we can finish up things as planned. So just to tell you about us, we are Gators for Asha, a student chapter of a bigger organization called Asha for Education. Our primary goal is to help underprivileged children in India. The modality we work through is we work with NGOs, non-government organizations in India. Those are called our project partners that are working directly with for the development of education for underprivileged children in India. So we partner with them, we provide them financial support and administrative support. And just to give an example, last year we we distributed around $65,000 through 4 or 5 different projects that we have in India. So part of our to get to our target of helping children in India, our thirst is to learn more how things are working in India, and for that we have various activities. One of them recently we have started a deep dive discussion in which we discuss different various social topics in India going on, and I guess today's talk is going to help us in learning more about India, and we have invited our speaker Samanth. So before we start, I'll just invite Dr. Sriram to give a brief introduction for Samanth.
Thank you, Devesh. Thank you all for coming. Before we have Samanth take over, just want to give a small introduction. I want to start off by thanking Asha, with Dr. Meera Sitaram, who's the faculty advisor, and especially Shiva, who's been instrumental in handling this whole thing along with Devesh. So just yeoman service that's being rendered here. So I'm just so glad that all of you could be here and that we could have this event. I don't want to take up too much time from Samanth's talk, but I just want to say a few words. My friend and colleague, a distinguished social psychologist, Melanie Green, she talks about this notion of transportation into a narrative world. So the idea that you can just be so completely immersed in something, and so it's such a mesmerizing experience sometimes. We're talking about mediated experiences that you just lose a sense of where you are. So you're just so completely immersed, right? And this normally happens with more immersive media. So we talk about it in terms of film, in terms of television, and sometimes it's also been structured to include fictional narratives, okay? But rare is the case when you can really think about how non-fiction can just so completely capture you. So the speaker today, Samanth Subramanium, is someone who I've been following for more than 12 years, and he's one of those people who actually fits that to a T. In other words, his words are so mesmerizing that he just captures that, and you almost like are transported into the world which he's trying to describe through those words. So Samanth has degrees from Penn State in journalism, and then Columbia International Relations. He's been the India correspondent for the National in New Delhi, and he also writes for just about all the top magazines and publications in the world. So writes regularly for the New Yorker. His last piece for the New Yorker was, again, something which is very relevant today, about the death of the Bangladeshi bloggers. So there's been a lot of executions of some of the bloggers in Bangladesh. So it's a very compelling piece that he wrote. He writes regularly for the New York Times, writes for The Economist, just about most of these top publications. He's also written 2 really compelling books, and I have both of them here, which I strongly recommend that you pick up. The first book was like a travelogue like no other. So this is Following Fish, aspects of which I think Samanth will allude to today in his talk, and won a bunch of awards. And his second book, which just came out recently, and the US edition is just out, it's called This Divided Island, and it's just a magnificent look at the aftermath of all that happened in Sri Lanka. It's a very moving account of some of these accounts. Finally, I just want to mention one other thing, which I think is a hallmark of Samanth's writing. Many of you here probably do not know. I think some of you alluded to that, and I also saw a Facebook post which said, is it the Samanth Subramanium? So it's not just his gifts as a journalist or as an author or someone who's a wordsmith, because words are just servants to his command. But what really makes it somewhat unique is that Samanth is one of the world's great trivia players. What we refer to as quizzing in India, what here in the US we refer to as trivia. So as a result, what happens is it brings this enormous depth of knowledge and erudition into his writing. So it's very, very illuminating without being esoteric or pedantic. So as a result, this is something which is structured into his narrative and makes for an even more compelling story. And so when Samanth was here, he's here on a 2-month fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. And when Shiva was asking whether there could be a person that we could bring in for this talk, I immediately jumped at this, and Samanth was kind enough to accommodate us during his busy schedule. So without much further ado, welcome to Gainesville.
Thank you.
Be here.
Thank you.
I'm also going to pass this. Copies, but you can take a look at this, and I would very strongly recommend both books.
Thank you. Okay. So I guess my background, I mean, Shri has given you a little idea of what kind of work I do. But I just want to put that in context a little bit for the kind of talk that we're going to have and the kind of conversation that we're going to have today. In the US, the style of journalism that I like to practice is something that's called long-form journalism, narrative nonfiction. These are basically, it's a genre of nonfiction that tells you the story of a person or a place or an event or a historical slice. It tells you the story in the way that a fictional storyteller would. It doesn't make up facts. The facts are still sacred. Nothing is made up. But the narrative will have a plot. It will have scenes. It will have characters. It will move you and draw you into the narrative and through the story exactly the way fiction does. And this is an old genre, and we're going to look a little bit at the background of the genre itself. But the fundamental question I want to address in this particular talk is, why don't we have enough of this kind of writing in India? And this, the genre is broad. It includes biographies, it includes popular histories, it includes even travel literature, it includes magazine journalism of the kind that the New Yorker or Harper's or the Atlantic Monthly practice in the US. So India is, it's at the very top level, it is a fairly literate culture, although I know the literacy doesn't extend too deep. But we've had a long tradition of journalism itself. The Times of India is, coming on sort of 200 years, or more than 200, almost 200 years, I think, in terms of how old it is. And there are several other newspapers that are over 100 years old. There are obviously, writing itself, a particular kind of scholarly writing, is an old genre in India. And yet we don't have the particular genres of narrative nonfiction that I talked about. So the question is, why don't we have it? And we're going to look at some theories, some possible theories for this as we move through this talk. I just want to, I chose this image for a reason. This is, if you go back to the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, you'll see this wonderful column by a writer called Teju Cole. He's a Nigerian writer who now lives in the US. And he talked about this photographer, Raghubir Singh, and compared him to the other more famous photographer of the subcontinent called Steve McCurry. If you remember that famous National Geographic cover of the Afghan girl with startling blue eyes, that was a Steve McCurry image. And Teju Cole makes this point that Raghubir Singh is really sort of a much more accurate and representative photographer of India. And we'll come back to Raghubir Singh towards the end. I just want to use him to make a point at the very end of the talk. Okay, so if you're from New Delhi, you might recognize this structure, but if you're not from there, I'll tell you that this is St. Stephen's College. It's a fairly old institution of learning. It's part of the Delhi University complex, Delhi University system. Many of India's sort of leading novelists, politicians, actors have graduated from St. Stephen's. And I use it only because I couldn't find an image of the person who I want to begin this seminar with. I mean, this is a guy called M.M. Bhalla, who was the head of the English department at St. Stephen's in the 1960s. In 1963, Bhalla delivered a speech on All India Radio, and it was called This Barren Field. His subject was the lack of good biographical writing in India. So he admitted that a certain type of historical writing already existed. This is the kind of history which is a broad survey of events and dates. What we need, he said in this lecture, what we need is not a meticulous chronicle of facts, but the recognition that history is a process which shapes men and which is in turn shaped by men. He said, note that he's left out women entirely from this, but this is perhaps reflective of the times that he was speaking in. Till such time, he continued, the field of biography may remain a barren field. So in a way, the subject of my talk is an extension of Bhalla's theme. 50 years on, we still don't have a thriving field of biographical writing in India. We don't have popular history, we don't have memoir or not too much of it. We don't have travel writing, we don't have long form journalism. So all this, these are the genres that I'm clubbing under what we call narrative nonfiction. So this is slowly changing, and I want to talk a little bit later about the change, but also about why the change is slow. But I want to, before I do all of that, I want to diffuse one question very quickly that is often asked. And the question is, narrative nonfiction, the genres that we talk about, it is a very Western style of journalism and of writing. And the question is often asked, why should we impose that style or that genre upon India? Shouldn't India sort of come up with its own styles of writing nonfiction? And I believe, clearly judging from the fact that I practice this particular genre of writing, I disagree with this question quite vehemently. I feel that it's, at its fundamental level, it's a very useful, valuable way of telling a story, of imparting facts and information. And indeed, in a democracy, this kind of writing is extremely crucial to inform the citizen or the citizenry about political or social or economic or cultural trends in his or her country. So I just want to, I don't know why people would insist that it's a Western genre or a non-Western genre. I think those labels don't work here. I'm sorry about the switching back and forth. It sort of switches into screensaver mode, but okay. So the first theory we can work with for why there is no narrative nonfiction in India is what I'd like to call a psychic theory, in the sense that it has to do with the quality of the Indian psyche itself. And we can start with this guy here, A.K. Ramanujam, who was an academic at the University of Chicago. He was a poet and translator. He was a linguist and an extremely good writer. Ramanujam wrote a particular essay. And the essay is titled, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? Ramanujam argues that there is neither the unique nor the universal in traditional Indian art and thought, as there has been in the Western tradition. Instead, he says that Indian art and thought are context sensitive, and he gives examples. Okay, I'm quoting from the essay now. The soil in a village which produces crops for the people affects their character. Houses have mood and character. They change the fortune and moods of the dwellers. Time too does not come in uniform units. Certain hours of the day, certain days of the week, etc. are auspicious or inauspicious. Certain units of time breed certain kinds of maladies or politics or religion. Now, if you have sort of some familiarity with India, you will see the relevance of what he's saying. The concept of the Rahu Kalam or the Rahu Kal, for example, a time in the day lasting 90 minutes to 2 hours in which you shouldn't start anything new or you shouldn't indulge in activities that are important. It is supposed to be an inauspicious time. So this is what he is alluding to. I would add to that a certain other sorts of context-sensitive fields. There are the rasas, the navarasas, the 9 emotions of Indian drama and poetry, and then there's the context that kind of pervades most of Indian society, right? Which is the context of caste. So that too is kind of a context-sensitive field. So you can think of all of these in one sense or another as buckets or categories. And the theory that Ramanujam was working with was that, look, if you want to describe somebody, if you describe enough of the buckets around him, you will have ended up describing this person to a fairly accurate degree. Now, this is not what Ramanujam advocates. This is just what this is his reading of Indian literature over the ages. He says that if you define somebody by their caste and subcaste, if you say where he comes from, and if you say what kind of house he lives in, and if you do these, if you his profession, for example, if you provide enough of these contexts, you will eventually come up with a fairly accurate definition of the person. The sociologist Dennis Wrong once called this an over-socialized conception of man, which I think is a very interesting phrase. And of course, these categories were much more rigid in pre-colonial India than they are in the modern era. So this kind of thinking sort of breaks down in this day and age. I should add a couple of things over here. Bhalla, who I quoted earlier, Bhalla himself, he gave his reading of this. He said, Indians aren't curious about the individual. His private self, they are not curious about his private self. They are curious about his public conduct. He also thought Indians had an anti-historical bent of mind. So I'm quoting again, our anti-historical consciousness has produced a vagueness of outlook, a divorce from life as it is lived, a certain kind of woolliness, a skepticism about the individual's place in society, and an uncritical mind where facts are concerned. And Bhalla is not the only person who thinks this. I mean, even today, if you go and you talk to people about the state of history departments in universities, about the state of neglect of Indian monuments, about the state of Indian historical textbooks, and how sort of loosely they are revised and compiled, you come to the conclusion that India and Indians are not careful about their history. There's another clause that people tack on, which is that after more than 200 years of British colonialism, what has happened is that India and Indians have become used to somebody else telling our history for us. And this is not necessarily an Indian phenomenon. This happens across colonized parts of Africa and Asia. And so once the British left, we have not developed the skills or the resources to be able to tell our history to ourselves. Now, I don't agree with Bhalla's generalization because it is a generalization. It is generalizing about 1.3 billion people, and you can't say none of these 1.3 billion people are curious about their history or their past. But I'm sympathetic to this colonial and pre-colonial hypothesis that that at some point our skills to tell our history to ourselves have kind of broken down. There's one other theory that I'll leave you with over here. In the 20th century, the dominant intellectual tradition in India has been the Marxist tradition. And Marxism draws its sustenance from downplaying the individual in the favor of society or class. So it is less useful in this particular tradition to write about an individual than to simply write about the social changes that have shaped him or her. So there's some kind of continuity here. You go from the traditional way of thinking in broad categories, these contexts or these buckets, whatever Ramanujan would have called it, and you go to a Marxist way of thinking, which is also a kind of broad, categorized way of thinking. You talk about people's class, and you talk about people's economic rather than caste-related context. So all of these, I lay all these out in front of you to emphasize that for a long time, and there are various theories, as I said, these theories about why Indian narratives do not prize the individual. They always look at the individual's background. They are always interested in providing a survey of a background rather than an accurate three-dimensional portrait of an individual, right? So from the psychic theory, we move to what I call maybe an existential theory. And I only say it's existential because it has to do with the very basic fact of India's existence as it is today, which is that it is a country with many, many people. Okay, and I'm going to start with these two people and a particular piece of writing. So in 1976, in the Journal of South Asian Literature, the poet Nissim Ezekiel, who you see over here, Nissim Ezekiel reviewed V.S. Naipaul's An Area of Darkness. And he ripped into it. He criticized it hugely. A lot of his criticism was just, of course, about Naipaul's condescension and arrogance. I mean, these kind of things that we've come to expect in criticisms about Naipaul. But he also said one other thing, which is interesting. His objection to the book was that the Indians Naipaul has described in the book do not sound like the Indians Nissim Ezekiel knew or knows. The title of Ezekiel's piece is Naipaul's India and Mine. And you can see the suggestion here. The suggestion is that there are two different Indias, and Naipaul's India is clearly the wrong India, and Nissim Ezekiel's India is the right or accurate India. So Ezekiel in turn quotes somebody else, who is this guy here, Narrating Chaudhary, who wrote a book called The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, which many of you may have read. So there's a particular passage in Autobiography of an Unknown Indian that Ezekiel quotes that Narrating Chaudhary has written, and I'm going to read that out to you now. In the preface to the book, Niraj Chaudhary writes, "An unstated reservation underlies the whole of my book. It is a reservation that there are exceptions to every generalization. In a country like India, so vast and so populous, the individuals who form the exceptions may well run into the millions. But in spite of the weight of their numbers taken independently, they are negligible when pitted against the hundreds of millions who constitute the norm." So here he has outlined one essential dilemma of writing nonfiction about India. And it's a dilemma I face often when I talk to magazine editors in the US about a story that I want to write out of India, an article that I want to write. What the editors want is for a story to be somehow representative of India itself or of a particular trend in India, right? And what I always tell them is that the number of stories that will fit that definition is, if not zero, very close to zero, because India is, as you all know, extremely diverse, extremely populated, both in terms of language and culture and religion and class. You know, there is no one generalization that will fit the whole country, or very few at any rate. And in my opinion, anyway, the kind of story that you can tell at that breadth, the kind of broad, sweeping story that will take in the stories of 1.3 billion people, in my view, it's not a very interesting way to do storytelling. In that kind of storytelling, the individual loses his or her face. Everybody just becomes sort of this massless group, faceless group, and the reader is very quickly bored. In fact, I should mention that it's not just editors here in the US or in the UK that worry about this, that worry about stories having to be representative. Even in India right now, you know, editors and publishers will say that they want a product, whether it's a book or an article or a magazine piece, they want it to appeal to as many people as possible. That is how it is phrased. And as I said, in a country like India, what that means is you have to flatten the ideas that you're presenting, you have to flatten the writing that you have to do. And it's not a very good way to do original writing about subjects that are often ignored. So this is one other difficulty that comes up when you want to write narrative nonfiction about India, is that if you want to pick one person or a small set of people to write about, are you running the risk of alienating the country at large? Are you running the risk of telling stories that only pertain to a small section of the population and not to India itself? Which brings me to another sort of theory. Let me call this an institutional theory. This is the Leah Library, which is the rare book library at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I'm based right now. The sort of research resources that a library like this or a university like the University of Florida offers, you know, these are the kind of resources that are sorely missing in India. You know, when I walk through the library, I should mention that I went to, as you know from Sri's introduction, I went to college here, both my bachelor's and my master's degree. And yet when I came to the University of Pennsylvania in March and I was led through my library orientation, I mean, you would have seen a look of pure lust in my eyes. I mean, it is a kind of literary and institutional resources that we just cannot find in India at all. And we come to take for granted if we are here in the US for an extended period of time. So we don't have this, and if we don't have these research resources, how do we know what has been written earlier? How do we research books? How do we, you know, it takes away a big pillar of this particular kind of writing. But this is not the only institution that is lacking. We don't have the institution of the magazine that kind of encourages this particular genre of writing, both by sort of serializing it or commissioning it, but also then by reviewing it. So it is a double-sided sort of encouragement. We also don't have publishers, or we only now have a small, relatively fragile ecosystem of publishers who are willing to go out on a limb to publish this kind of nonfiction. And then we don't have think tanks, the kind of institutions that will take in fellows and fund them for the duration of their research. And let me again mention that original research in this particular genre of writing, you cannot do without it. This is not the kind of historical survey when you can read 10 books and summarize their contents and present 11th book that includes the contents of the previous 10 books. That's not the kind I'm talking about. I'm talking about primary research, whether it's reporting for journalists, whether it's looking at archival material for academics, whether it's looking at surveys for people who are interested in broad demographic and social trends. That kind of research is irreplaceable. And the think tanks and universities that often subsidize that kind of research, we don't have. And why don't we have it? I mean, let's look at that. In Europe, the job of nurturing universities and think tanks and so on, the job of nurturing these institutions fell to fairly wealthy governments. These governments may not be wealthy any longer in Europe, but they were once wealthy, and these institutions were founded at that time. In the US, the job of nurturing these institutions has fallen to endowments that are set up by wealthy donors, wealthy individuals. In India, we have never had, I think in modern India's history, a wealthy government, and we are only now beginning to find a small set of wealthy individuals who will hopefully begin endowing institutions that can then grow into the kind that will support such work. Okay, I've left this blank because it will come up in a bit. I want to go to another theory maybe that interests me a lot, because it's almost a literary theory. You know, it has to do with actual writing as opposed to the ecosystem that produces it. And what is a question that we are posing when we talk about this kind of writing? The question is, how do we write in a way that prizes the individual and her experience? How do we elevate the individual in this process of writing so that the individual story, the subject story, it may contain enough that is implicit about her context, her environment, maybe even her country, but primarily what it speaks to is just the human condition, right? I mean, it is something that is human in all of us and that cuts across a lot of these other barriers like class or caste or religion or nationality. Now, in one way, we don't have to answer this question afresh because somebody or something has already done this for us. And I'm talking about the novel, because this is exactly what the novel does. The novel prizes the individual. Madame Bovary is the subject of this book. And through Madame Bovary, you learn a little bit about the France that she grew up in, the social circumstances that she was from. But more than anything else, you learn what it is, in a sense, to be human, to have human emotions and human conflicts and human interests. And Madame Bovary, therefore, does not speak just to the French. She speaks to the Americans, and she speaks to the Indians and anybody else who can read her. Now, the history of the novel in the Western tradition is a long one. You could argue that it goes back to Roman times, to the Satyricon by Petronius and the Golden Ass by Apuleius. These are both more than 2,000 years old. You could also argue that there's another book called Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, which is supposed to be the first novel written in English. That dates back to the 1400s. And there's another book called Don Quixote, as we all know, which is celebrating Cervantes is celebrating his 400th birth anniversary this year. And so that is, again, it's an old genre. So one could argue, the contention could be made, that for this kind of nonfiction to develop, where the individual is prized, you needed the novel to develop before it. That is sort of it's a necessary requirement for this kind of nonfiction to develop. The novel opens up a way of thinking about the individual in relation to her environment that is essential to this kind of nonfiction, and that is not found, for example, in our mythologies or our morality tales. So this connects very much back to what I said earlier, which is what A.K. Ramanujam was talking about, which is, traditional Indian modes of thought have not dealt so much with the individual as with the environment and the context. So the question becomes, when was the first Indian novel written? Is it true that the Indian novel developed so recently that we still need a few decades or maybe a century for that kind of nonfiction to also develop in India? So one segment of literary scholars in India think that the first Indian novel in any language is this one on top. It's called The Dancing Girl, a novel by Hassan Shah. This was written in 1790, and it was written originally in Farsi. And this was an English translation, a recent English translation. The first Indian novel in English is this here, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Raj Mohan's Wife. This was published in 1864. So now if you go by this theory, if you think that these are the, sort of the first Indian novels in an Indian language or in English, you would think that maybe that theory had it right, because maybe the genre of the novel itself is not established in India enough for it to spawn that particular kind of individualistic, novelistic nonfiction. But there are other scholars who identify earlier Sanskrit works as novels. So there was, in the 7th century, there was a writer called Banabhatta who wrote a romance called Kadambari, which is an intricate set of nested stories that has at its heart the thwarted union between a heroine named Kadambari and the hero named Chandrapida. There's also another book, in fact, in Kannada and Marathi, the word Kadambari even today is sometimes used as a generic name for a romantic novel. So this goes back almost 1300 years. There's another work called the Dashakumara Charita, which is also in Sanskrit, which is from the same period. It tells the stories of 10 young men, the Dashakumaras, and they get into all sorts of adventures with ghosts, gamblers, prostitutes, soldiers, kings, robbers. So it's an excellent version of the picaresque novel that Don Quixote actually popularized in Europe. So the novel is maybe not as young in India as we take it to be. You could make the argument that the novelistic tradition started only in the 19th century, but certainly we did have novels way before The Dancing Girl and Raj Mohan's Wife. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about my experience of writing Following Fish, because I thought that might be a little interesting to share as well. I should point out, while I'm talking about Following Fish, that this book is certainly not the first of its kind to do what it did in India. You have Pankaj Mishra's Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, which some of you may have read, which was published in 1995. You have Suketu Mehta's Maximum City about Bombay, which was published 10 years after that. And both those books do very much what the kind of thing that I was trying to do, which is you tell a set of linked stories about very regular people in India. You could call it sort of travel literature, because frequently all three books are classified in the travel genre. But really the only way it is a travel book is that it just goes around the country and talks to people in various parts of the country. And these were, and even after Following Fish came out and a couple of other books have come out, it is not an approach that many writers take today. So this is the broader subset of narrative nonfiction that I was talking about, long-form journalism or narrative journalism. So this reminds us, we mentioned earlier about how narrative nonfiction reminds us of the novel. It reminds us because it has plots, characters, scenes, it has a narrative arc, it has a conflict and perhaps a resolution. And we're talking about this in the US, and I think that's appropriate in a way, because really the narrative journalism subset of narrative nonfiction was born in the US. It's about 100 years old. If you think back to the early years of the New Yorker, if you think back to writers like Joseph Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, they were among the first to put these principles into practice. They treated their journalistic subjects almost as a writer might treat the subjects of a novel, and they treated their stories almost as a novelist would treat a plot. And this may not be a big surprise, because in American culture, I think more than anywhere else, if there is a central theme to this, it is the urge to tell the individual story. So even in fiction, even in Hollywood, the individual and her experience, her story are prized above all else. Following Fish was written somewhat in that vein. It was supposed to be a travelogue along the coast of India, but in looking at sort of many other travelogues that have been written across the decades, both overseas and then, as I said, Pankaj Mishra's book and Suketu's book, I wanted to do something more than that. I wanted to give an idea I didn't want to give the reader an idea of how to travel to locations. What I wanted to do was to travel around myself and give an idea to the reader of how people live along the coast. What is their interaction with the sea? How does living on the coast shape their food, their culture, their mythology, their religion, their politics, their environment? I mean, these are all aspects of life that are very different on the coast as compared to inland India. And just to give you one example, this picture on the right here is from the chapter that I did in Following Fish from Hyderabad, which is not a city on the coast, but it's in Andhra Pradesh, which is a coastal state. Some liberties that I took over there. And so the chapter was about this family in Hyderabad that has been administering a treatment for asthma for decades now. The idea is that you kind of make a little paste of the medicine, which is a proprietary secret. This is the medicine you can see here, it's bright yellow. And you stuff it into the mouth of a 1.5 inch or 2 inch fish, or a fishling, I guess, a maril fingerling. And you put that hole into the patient's throat. And there have been sort of, various parties over the years who have tried to debunk this treatment, but it still goes on every year. It's been going on, as I said, for decades now, several decades. And thousands of people flock to this treatment every year in Hyderabad. They come from various parts of India. Sometimes the Indian railway system arranges special trains to ferry these patients to take this treatment. Now, the question of whether this treatment works or not is immaterial. What is interesting about this is the story of this family that seems to be doing it, as far as I could gauge, for no monetary benefit to itself. They have been doing this as a family tradition throughout this time. And what is also interesting is the faith of these people who come, and the fact that India still has an extremely robust tradition of faith healing, of faith cures. So when I wanted to learn a little more about this family, I started to look into books. I went online, and I found that nobody had written about them in any depth. I mean, the only sort of articles you would find in newspapers were sort of articles that were written on the day of the treatment itself. It was just, 45,000 people turned up for the treatment today. It was very hot, and 3 people fainted. A couple of quotes from people who had attended the treatment, and that was it. And then it would be forgotten the next day. There was nothing about the background of this family or why they were doing it. And I decided that I wanted to find out a little bit more. Now, I mentioned this purely as an example of the kind of narrative journalism or narrative nonfiction that I'm talking about, because this is, as I mentioned, this was a phenomenon in a major city, in an major Indian city, and yet it had very little writing on it. This would be very surprising in a city in the US. If 45,000 people were flocking to New York City every year to swallow a live fish and be cured of asthma, you can be sure that there would be chapters and PhD theses and everything written about this by that time. So, yeah, that works in 2 ways, as I'll explain. This kind of journalism does have very few platforms in India now, most notably Caravan, which is a magazine that was restarted by its owners about 8 years ago. Many of the books that are now slowly starting to be written about contemporary India and contemporary Indians, whether it's by journalists or academics, they all have their seed in some way in Caravan. And certainly the journalists who are doing this kind of writing have at one point or another contributed an article to Caravan. There are a couple of other nascent sort of projects that want to do this kind of journalism now. But the Indian journalism industry, and I'm talking now about the journalism of text, which is print media and online and the online space, and not television, which is, Feel the Noise is an extremely good subtitle for the Indian news industry right now. This is a sphere in which the tyranny of the market operates to a really detrimental effect. The lack of real institutions in the journalism world which we talked about earlier, meant that any new magazine that is started must face down huge odds to be able to do this kind of journalism today. I'll tell you why. It's more expensive to start a journalism now, or to start a magazine now, as it was compared to 75 years earlier. It is harder to solicit advertising for print magazines. It is harder to compete for the interest of readers, given the other distractions they might turn to. But there is investment in Indian journalism right now, and the energy and money that are instead flowing into online publications like First Post, Scroll, The Wire, Catch, The Quint, Array. You've seen all these ventures of extremely varying quality that have all been set up over the last 3 or 4 years. So there is a pitfall in launching these websites with no prior journalistic brand recognition, because there was no print version of Scroll before Scroll.in was set up. If you compare that to timesofindia.com, indianexpress.com, when those websites were launched, they already had a print newspaper to rely upon. None of these have an existing offline product. So when these websites start competing with these Indian newspaper websites, Indian magazine websites, even websites from overseas, what happens is that the internet imposes a pressure to update very quickly, which leads to journalism that is shallow and that is mostly driven by just producing an opinion. This is why the phenomenon of clickbait, for example, arises. This is also why these websites tend to be mostly shrill, polarized opinion websites compared to the traditional print media outlets. Because if there's a time crunch, if you feel like you need to update your website in the next half an hour, the best and surest way to do it is to write something that is an opinion and that will attract readers by just taking a quick stance on something, whether it's well-founded or not. So this is a phase that many websites outside India were in a few years ago. And business models for internet journalism were still uncertain then, but they've evolved in an interesting way. And I will cite the example of BuzzFeed, which I'm sure all of you have read at one point or another. BuzzFeed was a website that started off by putting together cat GIFs and memes and listicles, 20 reasons why this Seinfeld episode is the best Seinfeld episode ever, or 20 reactions by a cat to a dog, or whatever it is. That website, that very same website, while it still does a lot of these things, it is now starting to employ extremely serious newspaper correspondents. They have foreign bureaus. They have a complete different section for investigative journalism and long-form journalism. They are starting to employ journalists in a way that no other newspaper, at the rate that no other newspaper is doing now. So maybe we can think that this is just a model for the internet age, that you first start off by building your audience, right? You start with the cat GIFs and the listicles and so on. But then once you have traction, once you have an audience, once you have some money, you start hiring the serious correspondents. And maybe that's the new model, and it may still work, I don't know. But the problem with these websites, the problem over here, and the reason that they may not be able to evolve in a similar way is because of exactly what we've been talking about all this time, the lack of a tradition of a particular kind of writing. And here, this is a cause, it's not an effect. Because if you don't have a pool of writers and journalists and academics who have been trained to think in this mode and write in this mode, and if you don't have editors who have been editing in this mode, then even if you want to go out there and start hiring these people, where will you hire them? This is something that BuzzFeed never had to contend with, because when BuzzFeed started hiring serious reporters and serious writers, there was a huge pool of people out there ready to be hired, people who had been trained in this kind of journalism, who had been reading this kind of nonfiction, who had been editing this kind of nonfiction. They were out there to be hired. We don't have that in India right now. And I think that is a problem that these websites will run into sooner rather than later. These institutions, these talent pools can't really be built overnight, right? They need at least a generation or two to catch fire. So what has happened in India is that because of the way technology has evolved, we've skipped all the institutional building stage, the part where you have the universities and the magazines and the think tanks and the publishers. We've skipped that stage and we've skipped right into the internet age. And that artificial leap of sorts, it's not an organic leap, it's an artificial leap, that is causing some of these problems. So in conclusion, I want to come back to another photo by Raghubir Singh, who was the photographer I talked about earlier. This is a photo of Subhash Chandra Bose Circle in Calcutta, and it was taken in 1987. So in this recent essay about him, Teju Cole, the writer, he points out that this photo is a slightly oblique, off-kilter view. And then he says, but everything is in its right place. It reads as a moment of truth snipped from the flow of life. This is really a manifesto for the sort of writing we're talking about, right? Moments of truth snipped from the flow of life. Cole goes on to write, and I'm quoting again, art is always difficult, but it is especially difficult when it comes to telling other people's stories. And it is ferociously difficult when those others are tangled up in your history and you are tangled up in theirs. What honors those we look at, those whose stories we try to tell, is work that acknowledges that complex sense of their own reality. So I think the failure in India to produce significant volumes and qualities of a narrative sort of nonfiction writing is really a failure to focus on individuals, to recognize what impact individuals have on their surroundings and what their lives can tell us. Of course, writing about people is already a difficult task, whatever the circumstances. Just ask any writer, any biographer, any historian. In fact, there are a few lines from a Ranjit Hoskote poem that say it rather nicely, so it's a good way to end, I think. The poem is titled Questions for a Biographer. So some of it, which I'll read, is really a great representation of what we seek to do as writers of such nonfiction. Questions for a biographer. How to phrase what must be told, how to force the seals, twist back the locks, burgle the cabinet of his soul, how to rifle his cupboard of masks, and then to squeeze into the damp between costume and true color. And then he goes a little way in. I do not envy you, this biographer. To you, his grief is so much code to scan in the mirror. A sharp task you have set yourself, safecracker of private language. Though with frank hands you unbolt his fame, the pain tricks you, and that is hard, to place his ashes in an urn and weeping mock them. This you learn. And here again, his baffled, guttural voice, growling a refrain to these afterlife rites of murder and rebirth. And the penultimate passage, the mannequins on test, toying with anecdotes, you slit his windpipe, render his sour brogue in the fluted accents of civility. Render his sour brogue in the fluted accents of civility is really the task of a nonfiction writer, of a biographer, of anybody who seeks to write about people rather than just of the broad sweep of history. So that is my talk, and these are my theories and my some theories I agree with, some theories I don't, but these are interesting ideas to keep in mind as maybe we have a discussion about writing and journalism in India today, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you may have.
If you have questions, can you please come close to the microphone?
Wow. No. I'll repeat the question. It's fine. I want everybody to come back to the mic. Yes, sorry.
I thoroughly enjoyed your book, Falling Fish.
Thank you.
It was very wonderful. What was the inspiration for that book? How did that idea start?
Okay, so the question is, microphone, how did the inspiration for Following Fish come about? I mean, a lot of these are very sort of, very boring inspirations. I mean, it's not like I kind of, grew up idolizing the coast or anything like that. With both my books, I will tell you the boring story behind why these books came about. Following Fish came about in a very boring way because an editor at Penguin Books came to me and said, we have been thinking about a travelogue along the Indian coast. Would you like to write it? And I said yes. And that was just all it took. I mean, the backstory here is I'd been writing for travel magazines a little bit before that. And I think the editor must have read something and thought that maybe I would like to write this book. Of course, the concept of the book is was completely left up to me. And I think if it was, done by somebody else. They may have done it. They would have done it in a completely different way. Maybe they would have started from Calcutta and taken the train and gone all around the coast, which is a very good way to write a book. Also, I, partly because of my own circumstances, I was working in a job in a newspaper at the time, so I could only sort of make episodic trips to places along the coast. So I thought what I would do is each chapter would be its own essay or its own story, and in that way I could represent multiple parts, multiple aspects of life along the coast. So that's how that happened. The second book, which is titled This Divided Island, which is about the Sri Lankan Civil War, happened again in a very boring way. I was sitting in a newsroom in Delhi in 2009. It was May 18th, and the civil war was ending literally in front of our eyes because they were parading the corpse of Velupillai Prabhakaran, who was the leader of the Tamil Tigers, on television, on the news channels. And that effectively signaled the end of the war. And so I sat in that newsroom and I looked at it and I thought, as any journalist would think probably, this is a good time to go to Sri Lanka and travel around and talk to people who have not been able to tell their stories for 30 years or more, travel to places that have been closed off for 30 years or more, and tell the story tell a history of the Sri Lankan war. Now that the war is over, you can tell a complete history. So, the question I'm often asked is, did you write the book because you were Tamil and you also felt that you had a vested interest? Sometimes I lie and say, yes, that's part of it, but mostly it's just a journalist trying to tell the story. And I think that's the driving instinct. Yeah?
So, sir, it's more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
I would not probably agree with the conclusion which you draw, and especially with the Sanskrit books and the works which you have quoted. So do you consider Sanskrit works as a part of Indian, when you talk about Indian literature and Indian evolution of its own, literary works, do you consider those a part? Because when I see, if you talk about biographies, we have had books like Akbarnama, we have had books like Prithviraj Raso, which are like 1,000 years old. If you talk about plays, we have had like Abhigyan Shakuntalam, and these are all I know without any I have no knowledge. And if you talk about narrative, I've read a lot of work on Bhakti movement in India, which is very narrative, which goes into bhav and how an individual's emotions are, and these are like long stories.
Absolutely.
So there is a very rich context. What I see is there is a lack in the modern concept, especially in the English literature, because the new way in which we are taught is all English, and maybe there is a lack.
Sure.
So I wouldn't say that the Indian, as as a civilization, we don't have. Rather, we have produced some of the very big epics,
Absolutely.
and plays and dramas. So,
and what A.K. Ramanujam would say to you in response is, those are all context-sensitive works. That it is not necessarily about an individual portrayed in all his flaws and glory. It is about an individual only in the sense that he relates to his environment. So if it is a person who is in the middle of a bhakti movement, the focus is the bhava and the bhakti. It is not the individual itself. The individual may be faceless even. If you look at, which is why, as I said, Kadambari, for example, is an excellent novel, which is about a particular person. So the novelistic tradition is very strong in India. But by and large, the context is everything in this particular case. To write a biography of Akbar is very different from writing a biography of a much lesser known person, of a person qua personhood, right? Akbar was written about because he was a king. And so in that sense, that is not what A.K. Ramanujam would be talking about when he says there are no context-free environments, no context-free narratives. You would not write about somebody who is interesting and not maybe extremely high up in a political or social or religious hierarchy, right? Somebody who is in the middle run. I take you back to, let me see if I can find some examples. This is a good example, right? This is an interesting example. The family that drives this treatment is not at the top of a clan or a caste. They're not somebody who are extremely wealthy. They're not somebody who are even religious leaders in that sense. They just administer this. But nobody would have written about it. So in that sense, I think there is a divergence between what you were talking about. Because I agree with you completely. These narratives are all extremely valid. But I think Akbarnama was written and Babarnama was written because they were kings and because their kingship was under scrutiny as opposed to them as people. And if you've read the Akbarnama is not necessarily very sort of, It is clearly a narrative written by somebody who was in his court. It is a courtier writing about his master. It's not a biographer writing about his subject. So that would be, I think, what I would say in response. Yeah? Oh, sorry, one sec. I'll just come back to you. Let me just quickly go around.
Okay. Thank you for that engaging talk.
Thank you.
I am a cultural anthropologist, so your take on journalism definitely resonates with my ethnographic writing sensibilities.
Yeah.
My question is, and I'm sorry if this is polarizing, but with the present political climate in India.
I was betting myself as to how many questions it would take before the present political climate. It went to 3, not bad. I thought like maybe the first question itself would be, what do you think of Narendra Modi? So good. Okay, good, excellent.
So yeah, with the present political climate where there's an apparent silencing of voices, do you think there's an added challenge to this kind of individual-centric long-form journalism? We go on social media and we hear horror stories every day. There's a lot of negativity coming out. How much of it is an exaggeration? How much of it is an accurate representation of reality?
Oh, now he's zooming in. No? Nice, good, very good. Yeah. I have to fly back to India next week, so put it on YouTube after that.
Can I tag,
Yeah, sure. If it's related, yes,
actually
absolutely.
add a little bit of context to it.
Sure.
That was going to be my second question.
Okay.
Actually, that question and that issue is actually very relevant to us, especially Gators for Asha. We've actually had several discussions where we've discussed the intolerance climate as such that's being discussed. And not just as a hot topic that's in the papers every day, but we actually, like Devesh was saying, we work very closely with the projects and things like that. And several of them need the FCRA clearance from the ministry and being non-profits, getting funds and things like that. A lot of them have expressed a lot of their concerns about being subjugated or not being able to express their intentions or their opposition. And so we've had a lot of discussions amongst ourselves about empowering them to speak up, using things like the RTI to be able to get information and to feel not being controlled by these things, especially after some of the latest developments.
Okay.
So I'm sure that was definitely on most of our
everybody's mind. Yeah, I feel like I answer this question, everybody leave. Like nobody will want to talk about non-fiction anymore. Okay, there's a complex answer to this. Okay. One part of the complex answer is because, as I said, we've not had a tradition of either people who do this kind of writing and journalists and institutions that support it. That was not likely to change overnight once a new government came in. So it's not like if the new government had been different, or if it had adopted the same kind of attitudes to the previous government, it's not like there would have been an efflorescence of this kind of writing. It's not like that kind of writing would have sort of suddenly started seeking energy or growing or whatever. So, and to add to that, which follows on from your question, which is very relevant, this government may be wary about its politicians being written about, and we'll come to sort of the intolerance and the cracking down on free speech part. But I should point out again that the kind of writing I'm talking about goes far beyond politics. In fact, sometimes I would encourage people to not write about politicians. For multiple reasons. I feel like right now in India, and it has been the case for some time, but right now in India, writing about a politician is in essence a dishonest task. And I'll tell you why. As a political reporter, when you go out and you write about a politician, you find out a lot. There is a certain sort of pool of common knowledge that you dip into, in which, particularly if you're in Delhi and if you're writing about national level politicians, in these circles in Delhi, it would be common knowledge that, for example, X is corrupt, or Y favors this industrialist, or Z is doing this in this particular underhand way. Now, whether that's true or not, you know now that this is common knowledge, right? You may not be able to prove it. Very often, it's very difficult to prove these things without documents. Usually, paper trails are not left. This is the essence of corruption. And so you may not be able to prove it. Now, to go ahead and write a profile of a politician, knowing what you know, but not able to put that into your piece, I feel as a journalist is a dishonest task. I feel that I know more than I'm putting out there, and that in some way I'm misleading my reader. And this has been the case for a long time. More and more access to politicians has been constricting. The kind of standards of proof that you need to prove something, they are increasingly becoming higher and higher, because not only because institutions, papers and magazines can be sued, but also papers and magazines invariably are vulnerable to political pressure. And so you need an extremely high level of evidence before you can say something about a politician. And so now I'm increasingly choosing not to even do these kind of profiles and not to even do these kind of pieces. So that is one part of it. So I feel like nonfiction really in India needs to look beyond writing about politicians and bureaucrats. I feel there's so much more. And there are more stories to be told. There is virtually no science writing in India to speak of. There is no writing on art. There is no writing on culture. I can count on one hand the number of film critics we have who are any good. I can count on two hands the number of book critics we have who are any good. Nobody writes about writers as individuals. It's always all reviewing. Nobody writes about academics and their work as they do over here in the US or in Europe. So there is a huge, vast field to be explored. There are historical figures who are just not written about at all. So I feel like even if and we'll debate this, I'll come to this just now, but even if this government had cracked down on people writing about politicians, there is a whole other field out there that I think nonfiction writers should be looking to. Now, has there been a crackdown on dissent? No, because I feel like if you went on Twitter and you're reading about this stuff, a really good crackdown on dissent would be cracking down on that also. So I feel if you're able to read about it, chances are that this is not quite the emergency. This is not sort of a fascist environment yet. But there have been enough things happening that are starkly different from what the previous government did, both in terms of pressure on institutions, magazines, universities, publishers. There has been a certain, the courts have been much less willing to defend freedom of speech and expression. And as you pointed out, the action against NGOs has been much more severe than the previous government. And those things are worrying. So, and let's not also let the previous government off the hook. The previous government also banned a certain number of NGOs. The previous government also, sort of imprisoned cartoonists under sedition laws and so on. So, I mean, we have a tradition in India even of stifling dissent. It has been exacerbated a little bit in this current political climate, I feel. And that is worrying. And it is worrying also because the party that is in power at the moment is allied to a theological organization called the RSS, which has a certain number of foot soldiers who will feel empowered by what the government does and feel empowered to take matters into their own hands in a way that the previous government never did. The previous government never had a sort of allied organization that would go out and sort of carry out its implicit bidding without explicit orders. This government has that. And that is worrying. And the kind of empowerment that has been given to these people, that I worry that it will spread. So that's a long answer to your short question and to your short question. But if you would like me to explain anyone, or if you want to talk about this in greater depth, I'd be happy to take more questions. Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. What else does it have, this medicine? The fish and the...
Oh, nobody. Okay, so this actual paste, nobody knows. I took the treatment because as a good journalist, I felt I should take the experience. And I could only taste what we call asafoetida or hing, because that's very powerful. It's overwhelming. But I couldn't tell what was in the rest of it. I'm sure there was some turmeric, judging by the color. But they make it in a sort of ceremony, ritualistic sort of way in their house. It's very secretive. I wasn't allowed to watch it being made. And they just put these little gobs of it into the mouth of the fish, and they put the fish in. The theory is that the fish is still alive as it goes down your throat, so it helps disperse the medicine better. Now, if any professors of anatomy would know, if it's going down your digestive pipe, it is not going to disperse it to the windpipe or your lungs, but yes, that is part of that. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
When you went to Sri Lanka, did you have the chance to stay with the families there, or what else? And also, thank you for writing the book.
Oh, you're welcome, and I hope you like it if and when you read it. In Colombo, I stayed by myself because I was there for 10 months, so I had to rent an apartment. But in a lot of other places, in Jaffna, in Trincomalee, I stayed with families because at the time I went, there were no hotels to speak of. And so the only thing you could do is ask friends of friends if they had a room, and I would just stay in that room. I think in Jaffna, there was one sort of, a guest house, I guess, a lodge. So I would stay there occasionally. In Trincomalee, I stayed with friends. Yes. Yeah.
So another question. Earlier you were talking about history and history departments in India and the way we were all, I mean, generally the way we were all taught history was, in my personal opinion, not interesting at all. One very important aspect of education with respect to history in India was that the subjectivity of it was left out completely.
Mm-hmm.
As in, even when you mentioned, you were talking about accurate portrayals of people.
Mm-hmm.
How do you call something accurate when it's subjective?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
The answer, and this is something that I've found in journalism itself, and this is it's a question that you grapple with all the time, right? If you're writing a book, because let's get the myth out of the way that journalists need to be objective. Okay, no human being in the world is objective, and especially if you're a journalist who is learning more and more about your subject as you go along and do your work, whether it's a book or whether it's a long article, the more and more remote the chances get that you're going to be objective, because all this knowledge will undoubtedly influence you. So no journalist is objective. There is no point looking for objectivity I think in a long journalistic work. So then what can you look for? In my opinion, you can look for two things. You can look for fairness and you can look for transparency. What do these mean? Fairness, in my opinion, means you try to talk to as many people as possible. You try to double check facts. You try to talk to people on both sides of a divide. You do not take anybody's narrative at face value. You do your homework. You do your own independent research. All this, in my opinion, is fairness. The more interesting thing, I think, is transparency. Because if you're writing, for example, a book about the war, where there are stories of people dying, of children being forced to join a military, a sort of militant group, or if you hear stories of an army shelling a bunch of civilians, there is no way you can be objective in the face of this information. So the thing to do, I think, is to make your subjectivity transparent. If you're coming to an opinion, you lay out for the reader why you have formed this opinion. You lay out your thought processes. So very often people have a problem with journalists inserting themselves into the narrative. And to a large extent, I have a problem with that also. The journalist should never be the focus of the narrative. But it is very useful and quite honest, and it makes the narrative stronger if you show why you are beginning to form your opinions. Because at that point, the reader can say, either this particular mode of thinking is bullshit and your logic is flawed, or you can say, okay, I empathize, and this must be sort of why it's happening. I think that's the best thing to do in these particular cases. If you lay it all open, in a sense, if everything is on the page, then you are being completely honest and fair, in my opinion. Yeah, you had another question.
Sir, I read your article regarding Priya Pillai and other NGOs, and especially, a couple of questions raised on NGO. I think NGOs in India, they act very, very subjectively. They will take one issue, they will talk only on that. So, for example, I was looking at these debates on beef ban, and I did not find any animal activist sitting there in the debates. However, when it came to Jallikattu, considering you are from Tamil Nadu, I saw 3-4 animal activists sitting in these debates, and I found it, a very as a student, what's going on, because killing a cow is better than playing with a bull. Or I found activists also are very they are very focused on a certain group, or they act in a certain focus. Their logic doesn't apply to the entire framework or the entire society. So considering such kind of work done by some of the very famous NGOs, I found out that when these NGOs, are they the sole keepers of freedom of expression or freedom of whatever the way they say they at least portray themselves, or at least claim?
First of all, the NGO space is large in India.
Yes.
There are many that do shoddy work. There are many that do good work. So I think it is difficult to generalize.
Yes.
So let me get that out of the way first. I'm not aware of the particular debate you are talking about.
Yes.
I think it would be very easy to resolve that debate, because the beef ban it refers to a fundamental right to eat what you want to eat. whereas Jallikattu, in my opinion, and I've sort of seen it up close, is unfair cruelty to a living animal. And so I think it's very easy to resolve that. I don't think there's any hypocrisy in supporting one and defending the other, supporting one and decrying the other. Okay, but let's come to the who is the keeper of the rights of Indians. The keeper of the rights of Indians is the judiciary and the parliament. NGOs are welcome to shout themselves hoarse, in my opinion, about anything they want. It is up to parliament and the judiciary to decide whether those rights, whether these things infringe on any fundamental rights or if they infringe on any law. So in my opinion, targeting the NGOs is somehow mistaken, because you are targeting one message that somebody is putting out, and there is a counter message obviously that is being put out from somewhere else. And given the number of times and the ease with which the Indian state infringes upon the rights of regular Indians, I would feel that the ecosystem of NGOs is a vital necessity in India. I think if you subtract these NGOs, as in the medium term, we will have hell to pay as a country. I think the state will ride roughshod even more easily over the rights of the poor and the disenfranchised. And actually the relatively well off. The state will tell you what to eat and what not to eat, what to wear and what not to wear. And if that is the kind of state we want to live in, we can get rid of our NGOs. But there is no doubt in my mind that these NGOs are necessary to the functioning of India as a democracy. You don't have to listen to them. And if a party says that this set of NGOs is working against the development of the country, feel free to vote for that party. But outlawing the NGOs themselves is a completely mistaken mode of action. Yes.
So the message of how we've generally we focus on the context as opposed to the individual resonates.
A.K. Ramanandam, it's not my message.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the resonates very strongly with me, and I think it's just not journalism; like it's spread over several things. I mean, probably also politics, right? So
definitely, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So one of my thinking is, I know you talked a lot about the history of the free-form narrative journalism, but what about the history about how this context-sensitive approach is important? Of course, I can see, because there's so much of diversity and things like that, we can focus on it. But also, there's been, for example, I'm thinking about like just the print media for over the years, and how there's a lot, even in the print media, there's always been a focus on, again, context specific information. There's never information about, it's always been 3 Dalits killed or software engineer commits suicide as opposed to.
Well, I mean, okay. In these cases, let me quickly, those cases may not be the right ones to focus on, because what you're doing is giving me headlines.
Right.
So to say Ashok Sharma was killed will not mean anything to a reader. I think the headline is just meant to convey a basic level of information. If you drill down into the story, you will learn the software engineer's name, you will learn why he committed suicide, you will learn how the 3 Dalits were killed. So, I mean, in that sense, I think the headline is definitely not the way to analyze this. You are right in the sense that if Dalits were killed, the day of 3 Dalits were killed in a village, for example, the daily newspaper will have a short, brief summary, which is what daily newspapers do. But it is the responsibility of non-fiction writers to go to that village and to find out more about these individuals and why they were killed. And in that aspect, as in many other aspects, Indian non-fiction writers are falling short. They're completely right. They do treat it as a context-sensitive event, and they tend to treat it as something that just happens in villages, and they are not giving these individuals their due as individuals, right? That's exactly what you're saying, and I agree with that completely. Politics is another great example. I mean, if we look at the type, the people who are nominated by a party for parliament, for example, to run for a parliamentary seat, what are the buckets that surround them? It's very useful to think of it in this way. One bucket is caste, because you always, as the saying goes, you don't cast your vote in India, you vote your caste. So caste is a bucket. The party is the bucket. It doesn't really matter who the individual is, except in very exceptional circumstances. What matters is that he is the BJP candidate, and that so it is not so much what the candidate can do for your constituency, although he may or may not promise certain things, but he is the BJP guy over there. His individuality is subsumed under the identity of the party. And there is yet again another way in which it is wholly context sensitive and never context free. If we look at how the parliamentary system is actually, the Westminster system is actually supposed to operate, it is supposed to break free of a lot of the shackles that people have here in the US. I'll tell you why. If you're voting, if you're registered with one party or another, implicitly, although not in practice, but implicitly what it means is that you're only supposed to vote for that party. The Westminster system was supposed to break you out of that by having you vote for the person who you think will do the best for your constituency, regardless of which party he or she is from. And that in turn then comes up with, that will then comprise the legislature or the parliament or whatever. But that is not, in practice, that is not how it is working. So what we have done somehow is a hugely individual-centric electoral democracy we have converted into a context-sensitive electoral democracy. Yeah?
You were talking about the right to whatever you want to eat, right? So
yes.
I want to talk about right to live, who decides, you said who should, government should, the state should not decide what to eat and what not to wear, and stuff like that. But I think and you said because this can be a danger to the democracy, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think by doing this, I think we are tending to a better democracy, because this is not a man's world. This is not human's world. We are 1 in a million species, 55 million species are there, and humans are just one of them, right? So I think liberal and right should also extend to the animals' right, and should also extend to a right to live, not just for humans, but just for animals too. And the killings of animals and just for for the food purpose should be also extended not just to humans but to animals. So this is what I think. And the thing
that's fair, and that's a fair opinion, and I think you have a perfect right to that opinion. That's perfectly fair.
And things in terms of the rising intolerance, what you talked about these days, I don't think so. There is a rising intolerance, but what I think so there is a rise in this small group, which you can call a nexus or a cabal, that is against the government.
Mm-hmm.
A small faction who is really afraid about India being developed and going into that phase.
You really think there's a Who is this cabal? Who comprises this cabal? Who is afraid of India being developed? This is the kind of paranoid sort of conspiracy theories that people spread out without actually thinking it through. Who is afraid of India being developed? Can you actually point to a person and say he does not want poor people to become better off?
See, the thing is, you can drive the country till the time it's not developed, right? And India, people, you cannot point in a cabal. You cannot point it out.
Can you point to a group?
Yeah, a particular group, people the things in India, the missionaries,
Oh.
Do you want me to talk about the missionaries? They're doing what they're doing, and the things.
And they don't want India to develop.
Yeah, I think so. Because till the time, because development creates a thought process, and they give you a better sense of what you're doing and the depth of a culture, right? So what things if you're underdeveloped country, you can just go and talk to anybody, and you can change the opinion because you are from a developed country, and you know better, and you can say, oh, okay, so this is better, do this, pop culture is better, Western thinking is better. So people actually follow because they think okay,
Western thinking is better sitting at University of Florida. If you didn't think Western thinking was better, then why would you come to the University of Florida to study? This is a completely contradictory point of view that many people espouse that just feed these conspiracy theories. There is no big cabal. There is no, sort of tight-knit group of people and groups, NGOs and missionaries and foreign governments and the CIA and the Freemasons, who are kind of working to stop India's development. And if you think a small group like that can stop India's development, that actually means that our Indian government is doing a terrible job, including the present government. If you think the missionaries can keep...
The present government is just a 3-year-old government.
It's 2 years old, but yes, okay.
But
all the previous government, if you think that these people can stop India's development on the ground, it's a pretty poor sort of, development model and a pretty poor assessment of Indians as individuals. If you think Indians can't make a decision for themselves, if you think they are so easily swayed by people who come from the West and say that we want to help you but are actually hindering them, it's a, I don't.
It took them like 60 years to build that nexus. It's not just like a day. It's not an overnight thing.
Okay, well, I mean, as I said, it still contradicts in some way. If you are sitting in the University of Florida and decrying Western thinking and Western modes of thought and Western institutions, there's a certain sort of contradiction over there.
That is what I would talk about. Like, the Hinduism gives the freedom, the freedom to choose anything you want.
It's not giving anybody any freedoms right now, and it never gave lower castes, for example, the freedom to move up the caste ladder to practice alternate professions, to go into temples they were not allowed to.
For that, you need to understand the caste system of India.
I understand it very well, believe me, and every religion is restrictive to certain people, including Hinduism, and that continues today. So, I mean, there is a lot that needs to be done about that. Meera, thank you.
So we are running out of time. This is the last question.
Okay.
3 questions.
Sure.
Okay.
Because you're the faculty chair.
Making sure that nobody else asks the same question.
Okay.
The first question is, for any given Indian language, what would you say is the size of the population? Fix one language, English or Tamil or.
Okay.
What is the size of the population that is the leadership for potential leadership for this kind of?
It's an excellent question. And the answer is we wish we knew. Because the remarkable thing about Indian publishing is that nobody has done a publisher survey or a market survey in decades. Now we have some sort of method of at least estimating the number of books that are sold at point of sale. But that does not translate into potential leadership, as you rightly suggest. What we can only look at is the number of people who are literate in X language or Y language. But literacy itself is a sliding scale. So the people who are sort of functionally literate may not sort of go out and read books. So there is no estimation. It's kind of amazing. And this is one reason why publishers flounder. Because, I mean, even if you look at the number of people in the census who declare that they are fluent in English, for example, runs into the hundreds of thousands, just because of the population of India itself. The number of books that sell, however, is a small fraction of that, a tiny fraction. In India, if you sell 4,000 copies of a book, it's considered a bestseller. In the US or in most European markets, in most developed markets, sort of 7,000 or 8,000 copies is when a book starts to even become viable, let alone to then become a bestseller. So the answer is nobody knows. You can't. The problem is that you can't peg literacy to readership, and so that is something that when I say we, I mean the entire sort of publishing and writing industry in India we've been struggling with as a whole. So to answer your question, it's very difficult to say.
So the next question is, if you look at, for example, the dailies, the Sunday line, or maybe even a weekly, right? That I do see quite a bit of this kind of story about somebody local, right? So I'm thinking, not necessarily kings or public figures, just ordinary somebody local. Typically, every Sunday newspaper, Hindu, for example, take Hindu, and in fact, in the different languages, they have different people. So, in some sense, I think I'm not sure I agree with your assessment that the only people Indians want to hear about are luminaries or there's just ordinary people.
Sure.
There's one thing about a family that had a nursery with 200 plants or something like that, and they went and they did an in-depth interview of what motivates this family to continue having 200 this many plants. So I mean, I disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, my only counter to that, and you're right, but my only counter to that would be that to do it in a newspaper is still significantly different from doing it in a book. And so the initial premise that we approach this with is that where the narrative nonfiction or the nonfiction books, the biographical or historical writing, that premise, which is where is all of this? And why does India not produce more of it, despite the fact that it's a complex, fascinating country with plenty of people to write about? It doesn't translate into that. So even a newspaper story will be 1,000 words long, maybe more, maybe slightly less. It will, sort of talk about this family and the nursery, and that's pretty much it. But I think it never seems to make the leap then from sort of that to say a longer 4,000 word or 5,000 word magazine story, and certainly then doesn't seem to make the leap to a book. And this is the approach that I was kind of coming at. But you're right. I mean, in newspapers it happens a lot. Even software engineer committed suicide. On day 2, there will be something a little bit more about the software engineer. But it doesn't go beyond that. And newspapers in India tend to cap their length for stories mostly at 1,000 words. I mean, it rarely goes beyond 1,000 words.
Last question.
Sure.
So in the Forbes magazine that we saw, I think it was some organization, but this was the most, several magazines had it, but this was the most in-depth one, about a ranking of freedom of the press of the world, all countries of the world. And India was ranked 133rd, and it was just maybe 5 or 6 places ahead of Myanmar, Burma. Would you agree with this assessment? And I mean, you haven't seen this, so it's not a very fair.
I've seen it. I've seen the rankings.
So,
I mean, and India,
yeah.
and India has been consistently doing badly in these rankings over the last several years. It's not new. It is.
It's not new.
It predates this government and all that. So just to take it out of the political sphere,
I don't think it has to do with the current government.
yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Because if anything, it has slid only slightly.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's only ranked, a little bit above Singapore, and Singapore is a, pretty repressive in this sense of freedom of press, and Burma. I mean, that to me was shocking.
Yeah, I don't agree with this ranking. I have to say, I don't know what their criteria are. I don't think. I mean, you're completely right. It seems a little ridiculous to class it in that set of countries. I believe the ranking also includes. I mean, it's not. So when you say freedom of press, it's not a direct cause and effect between political pressure and how the press operates. Apparently, it also includes, but this is the explanation I've heard. I haven't checked this out for myself. Apparently, it also includes business interests that may be tied to the newspaper or magazine owners. And so sort of how free a journalist would in theory be to report upon, how free an open journalist for the open magazine would be to report upon the group that owns the magazine. In a separate sphere, if there's malfeasance in the telecom industry, but it's a part of the same conglomerate, he would obviously not report it. Apparently, this also factors into it. But as I said, A, I don't know. And B, I don't think this ranking is in any way reflects. I mean, there are definitely dozens of countries that do much worse than India and press freedom. So that's the answer.
We want to thank our speaker today and invite our faculty advisor, Dr. Sita, to hand over this souvenir from University of Florida. Few goodies from this guy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know what it is. It looks pretty big.